Kindness is a great subject to be talking about, isn't it? And it's been really encouraging to hear about some of the kind things that people have been doing to others over the whole of the pandemic period, things that we've seen on the news, but things that have been personal to us too. And I reflected just a little bit on the kind acts that have been done to me, even over this last 24 hours or so. The mug of tea, which is my favourite beverage that my wife brings me, the hug I receive from my children at various points during the day, the thank you card I received for the flowers that TBC was able to send to somebody during the week. Somebody who spent time with me earlier on this week, sitting me on the couch and telling me that I needed to focus on the camera that's in front of me. But just all of those little kind acts make your week go so much smoother. And as I was thinking about the subject of kindness, preparing for this Sunday, my mind went to a story that we find in the first half of the Bible, which we call the Old Testament. And it's a story about King David, probably Israel's greatest king, and how he showed kindness to someone. So I'm going to read that story to you now. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" And Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He's at the house of Micaiah, son of Amiel in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Micaiah, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to him to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth." "At your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I've given you your master's grandson, everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son called Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. It's a heartwarming story, and as I thought about David's kindness, a couple of things really came to my mind. The first thing was that David's kindness was the fruit of a thankful heart. Just want you to think of him sitting perhaps on his veranda or balcony or wherever he was in his palace, perhaps in the evening as he reflected on his day and perhaps on his life. And as he does that, Jonathan, his late friend, his late good friend, his late best friend, pops into his mind. I think it was one of those God thoughts that God sometimes does, often during the day, pop into our minds. And very often, if you're like me, you just move on to the next thing. But David clearly sat and dwelt on that thought of Jonathan, his good friend. And perhaps he remembered the times that Jonathan had been kind to him, his kind, supportive words to him, the adventures that they had together. Or perhaps he remembered the times where Jonathan stood up for him, because Jonathan's father Saul became very jealous of David at times, and Jonathan often had to intervene. And in many ways, Jonathan saved David's life. And so as David thought about that, it produced kind thoughts, positive thoughts in his own mind. I wonder how often you and I reflect on the good stuff that happens in our lives. It's so easy, isn't it, with the news that we see around us, the difficult things that perhaps we've experienced over this pandemic, to dwell on them. And often we get very inward looking when that happens. But it's good to reflect on the good things. And as one of the old songs used to say, to count our blessings and remember those things. Because often it will result in us doing kind things too. There's an old story about a man who had a dream that he was walking down the road when he met the devil, and they carried on walking together, and they came up to this really large building, and the man asked the devil, he said to him, what's this building here that we're passing? And the devil said, oh, well, that's the place where I keep all my seeds. Seeds of hatred, seeds of bitterness, seeds of spitefulness and selfishness and impure thoughts and envy. And it's so great because I can just plant these seeds wherever I want in people's hearts. And then they just do those unkind things. It's great for me to watch all that happening. And the man was rather startled by this. And he said to the devil, well, is there anywhere these seeds won't flourish? And the devil rather reluctantly said to him, I always find that these seeds don't flourish in the heart of a grateful person. And so, as David reflects on the good things, on the good memories of his good friend Jonathan, it inspires within him kindness. I wonder whether we need to do that more in our own way, in our own lives, and perhaps we'll find that blessing flows out of us more often. The second thing about David's kindness is that it was unexpected, and it was unexpected in a number of ways. I guess when we think about kindness, we tend to be kind to those who we know best, often our family and our friends. Or perhaps we are kind to people in a less honourable way who can pay us back in some way, who can do us a favour in return. Jesus was once at a meal and he talked a little bit about that to people. He said, whenever you give a luncheon or a dinner, he says, don't invite your family, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, your rich neighbours. Don't do that. If you do that, they'll invite you back so you can be repaid. He said, rather, I want you to invite to your banquet, to your meal. I want you to be kind to the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. And though they can't repay you, you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so David's kindness reflected what Jesus is saying here. It was unexpected kindness. It was kindness to a potential enemy to start with. Because Mephibosheth was a member of Saul's family. He was the previous king. And the way that often kings who were in residence would act would be to actually wipe the previous family off the face of the earth, to kill them all. because any member of the previous king might well be a threat to their rule, to their kingship. And David shows kindness to somebody who was a potential enemy, because Mephibosheth was part of Saul's family. David is showing here what Jesus encouraged us to do, to love our enemies, to love those people who potentially might do us harm. Be good to those who persecute you, that you may be seen as children of your Father in heaven. And Jesus is saying that when we show kindness, particularly to those who may not like us very much, that's reflecting God's love for us. And then David was kind too to people, someone who was on the margins of life. Mephibosheth would have been viewed by society as somebody who was insignificant. He describes himself as a dead dog. So that was his own view of himself. That was the label that he felt he had to wear as he went around. His prospects for life were negligible. He had never done anything for David, and David probably up until this point wasn't even aware that he existed. Yet it's to this man that David shows kindness. His disability wasn't a barrier to David's kindness. In fact, it only inspires David's kindness to new heights. And isn't it true that Jesus came for such people? People who were on the margins. When he gives his sort of manifesto in Luke chapter 4, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news for the poor. He's anointed me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." And throughout Jesus' ministry, he exemplified those words, reaching out to the poor and the marginalised, touching the leper, reaching out to those who were outcasts from society. Just like David, Jesus showed kindness to those on the margins. But David's kindness was also unexpected in its generosity. And when you think about it, it may even have suited Mephibosheth to keep a low profile. Perhaps the best he could hope for was that David would ignore him. But David instead shows incredible kindness and grace to Mephibosheth. First of all, he invites Mephibosheth into his presence, an honour for anyone who was part of that kingdom. I remember on our first wedding anniversary, Sabre and I went to this place, Hampton Court, and we were given a whole lot of information as we went round. It was a really interesting place, well worth a visit if you haven't been. But one of the things that was really impressed on me was one of the talks which told us how difficult it was to get an audience with the king. And often you had to go through several rooms and you had to have a specific invite. Often the very best you could expect was to actually go into the room and watch the king slurp his soup, and then you were dismissed. But to have a really intimate and useful conversation with the king, you would need to actually get invited into his private chambers. And here we have Mephibosheth, this person who was disabled, this person who had no prospects, being invited into David's presence. The second way David was generous was that he speaks to him with kindness and compassion. He speaks to Mephibosheth by name. You can imagine the sort of names that Mephibosheth was called as he went about life before he came to the palace. People would have talked about him behind his back and given him all sorts of unkind words. Perhaps dead dog was one of the names that he was given as he went around. But David calls him by name and he speaks kind words to Mephibosheth, even though he wasn't expecting them. There's a picture there, some of you will recognise Bukayo Saka, who experienced all kinds of abuse, didn't he, online after he missed that penalty. And I was so impressed with his response on Instagram, which was one of kindness and compassion after all that horrific racist abuse that he had suffered. And he wrote with Christ-like grace, restraint and dignity to those words of hate that he had received. He signed off by saying, "Love always wins." Words of kindness in the face of hatred. And David here gives Mephibosheth words of kindness. I wonder if we speak words of kindness and grace into those situations that we find ourselves in. And thirdly, David shows unexpected kindness in that he restores to Mephibosheth the land that belonged to his grandfather Saul. Kindness restores what was lost, land that would provide an income for Mephibosheth over the coming years, land that would give him a good quality of life as Ziba and his sons worked that land for him. David restores the family land to Mephibosheth. And fourthly, he allows Mephibosheth the privilege of eating at his table. Not the table of the servants, not the table of the lesser officials, but to sit at the king's table. Kindness far beyond what Mephibosheth could have expected. You know, as we reflect on David's kindness to Mephibosheth, surely it reminds us of the kindness of Jesus, doesn't it? The kindness of Jesus. Because you know, we haven't always been kind, have we? We haven't always been kind to God. There's a picture there of my two children. It was about just before the lockdown, we took this photograph. It's at Bedgebury, Pineaton. And I asked if I could take a photograph of the two. Jemima was very compliant, as you can see. This was Isaac's response. You can just about see his backside there and his yellow boots. It made me chuckle afterwards. But you know, as God is kind to us in so many ways, there have been times where our response has been like Isaac's, hasn't it? Just to turn our back on God, to all of his kindness and grace. But God's response to us turning our back on him and going away from him and going astray from him and doing bad stuff is to show us kindness in Jesus. And just like Mephibosheth, we are welcomed into God's presence, into his throne room. And just like Mephibosheth, God calls us by name, just as David did that for him. In Isaiah we read these words, "But now this is what the Lord said, he who created you, Jacob," that's another word for Israel, "he who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine." God calls us by name because he loves us. And not only that, he gives us an inheritance, just as David gave Mephibosheth an inheritance. "I go and prepare a place for you," Jesus says. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a guarantee that we're going to have that inheritance one day. A place to be near Jesus forever. And you know, just like Mephibosheth too, we are invited to the King's table. The last book in our Bibles, called Revelation, talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb, the great day where everyone who loves and follows Jesus will be together. And we'll all sit round that table, the marriage supper of the Lamb. But you know, we can enjoy Jesus' presence now. And in a few moments' time, we're going to sit round the communion table, This is the King's table that you and I are invited to. Whoever we are, just as we are, we can come because God invites us, just as David did Mephibosheth, to his table. Nicola's going to pray for us in a moment, but I'm going to ask the band if they come up because they're going to sing a song after Nicola has prayed for us. So thank you, Nicola.
Yeah, let's pray as we continue to worship. Father, I thank you for that amazing story of David's kindness. And it's a kindness that comes directly from your heart. You are the God of love. You are love. And you grow that fruit of kindness in us as we spend time in your presence. And we ask, Lord, that as we come to worship now, as we spend time with you, that you would draw close to us, that you would grow kindness in us as we know your heart more closely.